All right, good morning, everybody. We are about to kick off for day 3 of GCAP. We did have a beautiful welcome to country on Monday, but I would, of course, love to acknowledge that we are here on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and extend my respect and welcome to any First Nation attendees joining us here today. I won't introduce myself to you a third time, don't worry, most of you have already met me in some capacity. I'm just here to welcome you back and hope that you slept well, because while today is a shorter day at GCAP, we will be out dancing the night away at the Australian Game Developer Awards this evening, so I hope that you have all packed your fanciest shoes. If you've not bought an actor's ticket yet, but they actually sold out last night, so if you haven't bought an actor's ticket yet, we are kind of out of luck. I will just remind you to keep your GCAP badge with you for the AGDAs. As you can see, it's got a little pink line on it, and that means that you're going to the AGDAs with it. So please keep that on you. We cannot admit you without it, or it's going to be a whole rigmarole where I have to use my terrible handwriting to write on a badge for you. So please do not leave it at your hotel. Do not forget it. Don't leave it at GCAP. Please bring it with you. All right. Before we get started, I would like to once again thank our sponsors. So thank you to Creative Victoria, Screen Australia, Exola, EA Fire Monkeys, Big Ant, City of Melbourne, Hipster Whale, Screen Queensland, Sledgehammer Games, Vic Screen, City of Port Phillip, South Australian Government, LDB, Metric Computers, NBN, Playside, Screen New South Wales, Screen Tasmania, Ultimate Studios, Unreal Engine, Cam Rogers Legal, Gameloft, Paragon Interactive, Riot Games, and Screen West. I've been very excited to hear this keynote myself. As in calls leading up to the event, I've gotten to hear little snippets of what it will be like, and I am deeply intrigued. This keynote is the Developer Relations and Business Development at Wings, supporting their portfolio studios and looking for new games by female and gender minority leads. Part-time law student, she was previously the CEO and founder of Triple Topping Games, advisor to Kowloon Knights, and served on the board of the Global Game Jam. Her focus and dedication is towards a more transparent and inclusive games industry, which her work at Wings lends a lot to. Wings is a game fund dedicated to supporting women and gender marginalized developers who self-publish their games. Today she will be joining us to talk about how Wings' self-publishing model creates a more diverse games industry by helping close both funding and knowledge gaps for diverse creators. Please welcome Astrid Refstrup.
Wow, thank you for the very beautiful presentation. First, a little disclaimer, that's always nice when you have to say something publicly. This is the first time I'm giving this talk, and I think when we agreed on the subject and I started writing the talk, I included a little bit more about diversity funding in general and as first planned. And it's the first time I'm talking publicly about these subjects. So if everything is a little bit unclear, please do ask questions. It's always difficult to, in very short, on very short slides, formulate something that is a big part of your daily work and things you believe in. Also, sometimes I swear a lot because English is not my first language, and this is how I fill in gaps. So I'm very sorry about that. Yes. Oh, I have this clicker here. Let's see. Okay, so that is me, and you already so beautifully explained what we do at Wings. So I'm actually just going to skip this slide. Okay, I think when we are talking about diversity funding for women, gender marginalized developers, any kind of minorities in our games industry, it is important to acknowledge that this is not only an industry problem, because if we don't look at the bigger perspective of things, it can be difficult to actually come up with the right solutions. So one of the things I think is important to think about is that our society is already a patriarchal construction, and that is what our industry leans into. The games industry is a global market, it's capitalism, it's profit, it's revenue, and it speaks to the rest of our society. So, for example, the gross domestic product does not include traditional women's labor, such as bringing up children or preparing food for the family. When Adam Smith, one of the first economics, described how our modern society economic should be, he did not include any labor of caretaking. I think he even wrote very clearly that if you needed other people to help you, then you were lazy and you was not worthy of actually having an income. But the truth is that all of us, there was somebody, hopefully, that taught us to walk, talk, take a shower, get up in the morning, participate in society. Before schools, often mothers would teach their children to read, to do basic math. So there is a lot of skills in our society that is not at all included when we look at the gross domestic product of a country. And all of this labor, all of this value created every day is therefore in the shadows of how we value our society. Another thing I think it's important to acknowledge is that while we are, I think most of us in this room, as I got to know you over the last few days, are fighting for more equal rights in the games industry and the world in general, it's never something we will win. Rights to vote and family planning can always be withdrawn. And it's important to have that in the back of our mind when we are slowly trying to change the games industry and the societies that we are in. I was personally shocked. I'm pretty sure many of you were also shocked when the laws changed in many states in America. And actually women are dying because of this today, because they don't have the rights and the access to abortion, for example. And then the other thing is, because of all of these other things I just mentioned, there's a lot of biases in our society. That she speaks too much, she's too young, she lacks experience. I have personally experienced that and still experience that in the games industry, even though I've been around for about 8 years. And that is why you see this picture of me. Because when I used to have an office in Copenhagen, I will travel first class. It was not that expensive, and it allowed me to have good Wi-Fi access in the morning, so I could do my emails before showing up at the office. And every morning, someone in a white shirt, I think you call them blue collars, would be like, excuse me, I don't know if you know, but this is first class. And I'd be like, yes, thank you very much. So therefore, I bought this coffee cup where it's like, please don't mansplain me today. Mm-hmm. And then I brought that every morning and tried to turn it around. never really noticed, but it gave me something. So I think with this slide, I also set the premise of this talk. In the end, I will talk in more details about how we do things at Wings. And before I continue to the next slide, I just want to say that this is not meant as diversity funding in general is bad. It's just meant as a debate, something to talk about, something to discuss, something to keep in our mind when we're designing support for gender minorities in the games industry. Yes, I see there's probably more. I try to make it short and digestible. But I think there is a diversity funding issue in our games industry. And it's not necessarily that we don't have any diversity funding. So I'm curious to see if we receive less funding for more work. And on the next slides, I will dive into more details of this. But one of the things I see is there's some problems with diversity public funding programs and public funding programs in general. Platform diversity grants, women's labor is valued lesser, and mentorships but without any cash or actual resources behind it. So let's dive into those. This slide look a little bit weird. I didn't even make the slides. Krista made the slides. I just put the content in. So in our industry, in many places, we have access to public funding grants. We have that in Denmark, where I'm from. We have that in Europe. There's in UK. There's Canada, Latin America. Here in Australia, you have many different versions. It's a little bit similar to the ecosystem in Germany, actually, as I see it and understand it from the last 2 weeks. So, and I also know that might be people in the room who live somewhere without any access to public grants or public funding. I'm very sorry about that. But I hope you can still learn something from this slide. So when you're a minority, when you're a gender minority in the industry, it can be very difficult to access VC funding. It can be difficult to access funding from publishers, angel investors, and so on, because of the biases that we have in our industry. And when there's no other options available, very often what you then opt for is the public funding. And public funding, in most of the places I know of at least, is often has like a cultural content. That is like, if we, the state, the government, provide you money, we need to make sure, some places like you need to include local culture, it needs to have like a message to society, it's very much art funding. And I think that is great, because art does belong in this world, and games is a perfect media for expressing commentaries to our society in a creative way. But if you cannot find any other funding, this also becomes a kind of product you have to opt for creating. So maybe you actually had a little bit of a different game idea, and then you have to tailor it fit into the public funding programs. And I'm guilty of that myself when I ran a game studio. The first game we made were a platformer game that was like a little bit similar to Super Meat Boy, but it ended up being with a lot of, it's very cool about polyamorous relationship. That goes under the umbrella of public funding grants in Denmark. It was a great and very fun and very important story, but did it fit the mechanics of the game? Yeah, not really. And it became a very weird game. You can still find it on the App Store, I think. So I definitely did that. And I know, and I had conversation with developers where I asked, like, why do we have this in the game? And they're like, yeah, it's because we wanted to apply for public funding, and it's very important to include these things. And that is not the right reason for creating art and commentaries to our society, I think. Then government demand for diversity. That is also very important. I just want to make that absolutely clear, that I believe that we need to strive for diverse and equal boards and decision makers in our society in general. So therefore, you of course feel more welcome there. And it can be that you opt for those programs because you're actually seen and you're seen as valued, instead of going the other route of seeking angel investment. So these things are a little bit complex, but I hope you are still following me. Because of this, many of the public funding grants we see around the world also often has a smaller commercial potential. I know many programs try to keep this in mind, but it is just more complicated to include a lot of details when designing a product. And when it has a smaller commercial potential, therefore the studio you're building are maybe less sustainable in the long run. So solutions in many places that require more hours of work as investment as well, because then instead of like having the full budget, you may need to offer like they're only covering 50% of the budget, so that you can do sweat equity investment. And then we again have these from the second point, the diverse, the gender minority teams now also cutting 50% of their salaries in sweat equity because they can't find money elsewhere, because this product is not super commercial, because it has to fit into the cultural part of the art grant. So this is not meant as an overall critique of these art grants, just meant to something to think about, especially for those sitting out, maybe in this room, designing those grants today. So then we also have quite a lot of platforms like consoles. There's also been different kind of bigger game studios. For example, Wings have money from Riot. They made a diversity grant that we got some money for. That's great. We invested into a lot of interesting games. But sometimes these grants, diversity grants, are given to teams very, very early on in their game development. And with that, those teams also then end up guaranteeing that the product would go to that platform. That means that we'll have to take important business decisions on what is the best strategy for the release of the game before even like maybe the prototype is finished. And I have examples of that in Wings, where they got diversity grant very, very early as a team, before the game was really fully working, before we really know how much potential there is. And right now, then when you're like going back and be like, hey, now we're at 100K wish list, the game is this big, we have all of this potential, they basically promise to bring that to the platform for quite a small money. And when it's bringing that to the platform and it's already difficult for them to handle a lot of porting, like it's the first time studios, then figuring out how to bring that to other platforms and then have those conversations as well becomes more complicated. So I think this is something that these amazing programs that are meant to do something good needs to keep into mind, that sometimes maybe this funding, I know we all talking about prototype funding and early stage grant, but sometimes it's maybe not in the right context that we are giving them. Yes. Thirdly, okay, I need water. Sorry. So, the third one, women's labor is in general valued lesser. And this is something I think I often experienced as a founder of a studio and kept it running for 8 years. When historical women's labor is valued less in our society, this must also affect what kind of money we can ask for when we are pitching a game. And this is not a scientific report, but this is just from my personal experience. So what I'm thinking is, like for example in Europe, these are the numbers I have access to. Women in general earn 13% lesser than men. In manager positions, it's 23% lesser. So when I'm pitching a game and I come with a budget of 500K, people would often say it's too expensive. But I still have in the back of my mind, is this just because it's me pitching it? And if it was one of my colleagues in the industry pitching it, would you then think different of it? When I started my studio, I have a very good friend in Copenhagen. He also started his studios a little bit prior to me. And he once said, I feel every time you get 500K, I get 2 million. But we basically have the same pitch deck. So he saw it, and at that point, I didn't really see it yet. And we started to compare how we took our pitch meeting, how we would go about doing GDC, how we go about talking about our business and the things we wanted to create. And it was very similar. And he was right. Like, I got 500K, he got 2 million. So when he was like, okay, everything is funded, we can start to work, I was still out there fundraising and had to make a lot of ends meet to find all the money I needed to make my kind of games. So networking for funding has historically been unsafe for women and gender minorities in our industry, and it still is today. Still today, when people attend GDC, they will experience that drinks getting spiked. And I think that's very important to think about, that especially when you're like a very young person and you're going to your first industry events, people would invite you to parties and events and out drinking. A lot of the publishers will have the cool Raw Fury party and the cool Devolver party, and it's great because it's fun to hang out and network together. But it also involves a lot of alcohol and young people and talks about money and indies with extreme amount of power because they did make a lot of money. So there's a lot of power dynamics, a lot of alcohol and a lot of young people. And that is a very unsafe environment to go and raise money in. And for me personally, I think my first GDC, I just didn't know how at all to navigate it, because I was told you have to be everywhere and you have to be networking. And I'm still struggling with that today. And then the last one, this is very personal to me. A lot of conferences do not allow small children inside the venue, and if you, for example, if you have a very small child and you're still breastfeeding, that is basically a nightmare. So for example, Tokyo Game Show and Gamescom will not allow small children inside. So my option have always been, I had to travel with my small kids when I was breastfeeding, to have the kid in a hotel room, pump out milk, and then I would run back and forth to take my meetings. And it's these small details in the industry, like if we could just keep that in mind when we organize events, we could maybe make it a little bit easier for gender minorities to go out and raise money. Because that is very annoying. And there's nothing worse to be in a business meeting with Nintendo and your milk starts to run. Yes, been there. Yeah. Then we have the fourth one. And I see that a lot in our industry, because we are actually a lot of amazing and good people, and we want to make programs, and we want to make sure that we can change the industry, and sometimes we want to do stuff without even having funding ourselves. So the fourth one is mentorship, but with no money for it. So as women and minorities in general are seen as lacking experience, we are offered mentorship before we are getting money. And I have very often offered to be a mentor in different kind of programs. Actually, right now, I ended up being a mentor in a program where I thought they would receive money for prototyping a game, but they didn't receive money. So it's very nice for me to sit there on a call and tell them all about how, yeah, you take your demo, then you go to Gamescom, then you take this meeting. Oh, but we don't have any money to make the demo. okay. So therefore, the value I'm bringing is maybe less valuable in some way. Being a mentee is a lot of work. If you are running a studio for your first time, it's great to have access to knowledge, people that you can trust, people you can ask questions. But often in mentorship programs, it also requires you to prepare a lot. So we are putting extra labor on these teams already running for lesser budget, 50% public funding grants and all of that. And then they also have to prepare for the mentorship meeting on a Friday. Depending on the context, sometimes mentorship also ends up replacing providing access to funding and incentives that come with this. So instead of let's say it's a paid, okay, that also didn't happen very often, that the mentor is actually paid, then they pay mentors, but there's no money for these teams. And maybe instead we should just have cut out the mentor and ask them to go out and network in industry and then giving the money to the teams. It's a little bit of a back and forth there, I think. I also think there's a very high risk of mansplaining. I was providing mentorship in the beginning of starting my studio, and it felt like no one was listening to the knowledge and the experience I actually already had when funding my studio. And then it was 2 hours of he didn't even work in games. He had made some app with wines, explaining me how to make a scalable business, and that was not very useful. And then very often, as I already mentioned, mentors are often also a woman or gender minority, and they are also unpaid. So all of this good idea of sharing knowledge and experiences, I think we should continue doing that. I love being a mentor to a lot of teams. I also love being mentored by others. But we need to make sure that we are not just putting that in and we can cross off we made something for diversity and then there's no actual funding and money behind it. Okay, so first I wanted to, when diving a little bit more into how we do things at Wings, and I think Wings is only a tiny, tiny, tiny part of all of the solutions and debate we need to have around these things in the industry. I just want to make it absolutely clear that Wings is a fund for profit. I think maybe because women's labor is in general valued lesser in society, and having a mission to change something in society, people just think that we are an NGO and it's a charity. Because how could you think that a studio founded by women and gender minorities would make a profitable product? And this is something, since I joined Wings in February, I had to argue a lot. There's not been one conference, one event where I haven't had to explain both to developers and my colleagues in the industry, no, we are looking for games that can make profit. And sometimes they're surprised by that. The unique thing about Wings as a start is that our selection committee is only made of women. And I hope that at least takes away some of the biases. All of us also have biases against our own genders, of course, but maybe it just lowers it a little bit, making it possible for this committee to look at the game as a profitable product, a serious pitch by someone with experience and a goal of creating a sustainable business in the games industry. So, some of the solution. Wings opt for a self-publishing model, and I think it's important to explain why we actually chose this model at Wings, and that we could also have established a publisher, for example, or done equity investment. So we work with the teams of self-publishing their games. This way, instead of, for example, with a publisher, very often the publisher will go and talk with the platforms. That's nice, I have all the connections. We can invite the developers into these meetings. Sometimes the teams I work with are nope, thank you, don't want to be in that. And other times they're steering the whole conversation, but there's always a little WhatsApp discussion going on behind the scene where we scheme and make sure that we're making the best deals for the games. So this way they are part of the conversation and they are part of finding the right solution for their game and their studio. I also think it's very important that we acknowledge that these women and gender minorities making these studios or games are experts on the game. That they do not necessarily lack experience, they're just at a certain step in their career like everybody else entering into the games industry. And when not being the publisher but asking them to self-publish the game, we very much acknowledge their knowledge about their own game. And then I think personally we have some of the best terms in the industry. It was one evening I was sitting and working, It's like, we talk about transparency in Wings, and we sort of had a little bit on the webpage, but we didn't have the direct terms. So then I posted it, and then I asked for permission the day after, and they're still there. So you can go and read them up. And I think even though the terms are there, it's always important that if we give a developer an offer, that you still negotiate the terms, of course, because you also know like what kind of outcome you want from the business deal. So for this next 3 steps, I'm going to talk about industry standard money, transparency, I love how the little Y got down there, and professional respect. Okay, so industry standard money, I think this is very important when it comes to diversity money. Very often grants and money allocated for diversity is a lower amount with a certain pool each year. It can be public grant, it can be publishers, it can be companies, it can be platforms and consoles, and it's not always the standard. If like, you were like pitching a game, if you are a white cis man pitching your game, it's lower amounts. And I think it's very important that we change the amount and we stand behind that. We think it's serious that these games can make profit and these are great games that deserve to exist, and put real money behind it. And hopefully one day we have even more money, but I think the 5K USD per game is a quite significant amount. Many smaller to mid-sized publishers only go to 250, sometimes 500K. So I think this is a good starting point. And I can share a little bit this year of the game we have funded. All of them have been above 150K, and the biggest one has been a little bit above the 500K. So it's not that we put this number up and then we go fund a bunch of 50K games. We actually apply these monies to games. Another thing is we only fund PC and console titles, and that is because this is where we have our experience. I'm very often asking for mobile, and I know especially in some regions mobile is just what many developers would opt for, but we don't have the expertise there. So I would welcome very much if somebody else want to copy our model and apply their mobile expertise into this. I would also say in that context, like we can at the moment apply 500 USD, but that some business models, for example free-to-play, often require even more money than we can apply, and then it wouldn't really make sense to give them, again, too little to achieve the same thing. Second thing is in transparency. So these are our shares. We take 30%, we get the developer 30% until we recoup our investment. Then there's a 50-50 until we recoup twice, and then there's a 70%. If you're unfamiliar with these terms, just come up and ask me. I will describe a little bit better like what all of these things mean. I still remember when I started in the industry and I was like, but what is a recoup? English is also not my first language, so I was like, I don't know. And I think it's a responsibility for the whole industry to make more fair terms and allowing for feedback and transparency. So it can also be that you think these terms are unfair. That is also totally fine, because now it's up there and we can actually have an open discussion about it. And you can also let me know if you have seen even better terms out there in industry. I have seen better terms also out there in industry. Then we help with introductions to Xbox, Sony, and Netflix, and other potential partners. And there we always keep the developers CC on the email so they can see how the conversation is going and how we go about it. Some consoles would be like, you need to submit on this web page, and then there's this program, and there's another program, and you can use this program. I also try to guide them, and I ask our contact persons at the consoles, like, okay, so if somebody's making a multiplayer game, what kind of tools do you have, and other stuff, and try to guide the developers as well towards that. With most traditional publishers, you will lose this access. You will not be a part of that conversation. And I also think it's very important that you will become the publisher of your game, so you grow your own community and you keep complete control and access to it. In Wings, actually, the money flow from the developer to Wings. With many publishers, it's the other way around. That, of course, requires a lot of trust, but I think it also allows for more security for the teams, that especially just after game release, that they still have access to the money that they get from Steam, and then they can send it to us. Cash flow, it's a difficult thing to control, especially around release. Yes, the professional aspect. Again, the expert is a developer on the game, and with that, they're also an expert on the community. I think regardless of if you're working with a publisher, which is also can be a great solution for your game, or if you are working on self-publishing, community building is something that the developer have to do. There's just no way around it when we are talking indie games. We are always there to guide when it's needed, but if you're good on your own, it's also completely fine. Just give me an update. Once in a while, you can shoot me an email. And a developer can choose what partners they want to work with. So for example, if you work with a publisher, they will choose, either they have in-house marketing or they will use specific marketing agencies. And that can be amazing. Especially if it's a very big publisher that have a lot of reach. But it's also extremely annoying if the publisher is not lifting this task at all. I know for a fact from my partner studio how that feels. And then you cannot choose another marketing agency. You cannot go for another options. You just have to go with it or start to work even more yourself, which has been our solution in that case. The same goes for QA, localization, and marketing. We are always there to advise, send you to the right people. Maybe it could be a QA agency owned by women. So we are supporting the industry in general. But it's completely up to the developer who they want to work with and set it up. That was a lot of fast talking. So that hopefully there's room for questions. I'm looking at you, so yeah, that is it. Great. Yeah, questions.
Sprinter.
Thank you. Great presentation. One question on your funding. Do you tend to prefer doing funding, whole project funding, or do you get involved in part project funding?
That is such a good question that I should have included, because I get it so often. I just actually updated the webpage. Especially people ask if they can work with another project financing fund. We see more of those emerging, or a co-publishing. I think when we are looking at indie, so now I'm talking very big perspective here, so hopefully follow. I think when we are working with indie teams, we have to acknowledge that there's not the same kind of resources. And as soon as you want to combine different entities, you are a developer, then let's say there's a publisher and then there's Wings. The negotiation of making that contract where everybody agrees, that can be quite steep work. And all of us would have to pay lawyers, and they will have a lot of conversation and calls, and they take a lot of money. And that's maybe fine for Wings and fine for the other publisher, but for a developer, they would be those that has to steer that conversation. I don't think it's the right business decision to take, at least as a first-time studio. The other issue is if we take revenue and a publisher take revenue, of course we can agree who takes first and so on, but what is then left of revenue for the developer with everybody have making sure that they cover their risk and all of that. With that said, I love to be creative around these things, and that is also why I study law, actually. I want to figure out, is there different ways we can doing it. So if there is a publisher or any other, project financing out there and they think they have something where this could be a discussion, I'm always up for figuring it out. Just very aware we shouldn't put developer in a situation where it takes a year to find a deal and they're just waiting around and not knowing exactly what's going to happen.
Thank you so much for your talk. I guess the question I have is some publishers prefer to have a relationship with studios so that they release multiple games. They sort of have the first pick, so to speak. At Wings, do you prefer to fund just the individual game or to form a relationship with the studios to release multiple games?
I don't like rights of first refusal. That's just annoying. So if that was in a contract, we could always ask to get it removed. But in general, I hope that the way we are working with the teams make them so comfortable, and it gives me experience when I'm working with teams. It gives them experience that they come back, of course. And definitely there are teams where we have those conversations as well.
Thank you. Excellent talk. It was really interesting what you were saying about sort of the cultural versus the commercial requirements of a project. And I guess I was wondering, sort of in your experience seeing so many games, do you think a game can be really culturally authentic and sincere and also have a lot of commercial potential? Do you see those unicorns out there?
Yes, I definitely see those. I know it's tougher to make. This is actually a little bit similar if any of you were there at the first pitch session yesterday. We talked about that, and I didn't think I formulated my feedback there. It was like a game that had a lot of like queer themes and wanted to talk about gender identity and all of that in a game. And I think that's amazing, but always gameplay comes first when you are uploading something to Steam. So I think it was Chris from Fellow Traveler that said something in the line of like it's better to create a really good gameplay and then people are like, oh, and also this is about. So you sneak it in, maybe a little bit. But like there are successful games that have these kind of, like Night in the Woods, I think is a good example. So many years since that game was released. Please don't put it in your pitch deck. Like, look how much it sold. We cannot compare. But but I think that touched upon a lot of important themes, and it resonates with all of us still today, and it was also a commercial success.
Kind of going back onto your revenue sharing slide, is with the 3 tiers that were there, is that predicated upon the success of an individual project, or if in the future the project maybe needs a little bit more money the studio needs a little bit more money to go again, is that a negotiation position that you have with them, or does it require the first project to be a complete success before you have those discussions?
Is it the first point with the?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because there's 3 tiers.
Like these deals that we are making is very often these last 2 games assigned. One of them have a Steam page I don't think people have discovered, and one of them is not even announced. So very often that is a stage we get in, or it can be that they have a Steam page and they're building up a following, and now they are like applying for funding basically. So that's usually when we get in. So it doesn't necessarily have to be successfully. I would say that if you have a game on Steam and there's no traction on that Steam page, it can be more complicated to get an offer, especially from Wings, because we cannot throw you in a big pool of a big audience and then start generate wishlist. Did that answer the question?
Yes, but it was more like if they have successfully gotten funding from you and the revenue sharing maybe puts them slightly beneath their ability to go again, does that mean that they can renegotiate for a second investment from you, or is that not?
Okay, so all games go over budget. We keep that in mind when signing them. If a game is like moderate successful, like we would keep those terms because we need to make sure that we are recouping, I would say. If a game is very, very successful and everybody got what they wanted out of it, I think that's also sometimes like late stage. It could be like 5 or 10 years after release. You would have a conversation and being like, hey, thank you so much for the collaboration. Maybe that answered it.
Yeah. Yes, it did. Yeah.
Cool.
Questions? I saw a hand up the back, but they've gone. All right. If there's no more questions, I think that wraps it up.
Yay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Turn this off before I give myself feedback again. All right. Thank you so much, Astrid, and I'll get another round of applause for that one as well. Very, very informative, and real-world examples are always something that I'm looking for with this, just to see like what actually works in this industry as well, in terms of funding. So thank you. We are back out to morning tea in about 20 minutes. So please keep yourself fueled. We do have to get through the AGDAs tonight as well. So eat, hydrate, and I will see you later today.